Every single day, millions of men wake up, reach for their phones, and voluntarily lock themselves inside a prison they built with their own hands. They don't see the bars. They don't feel the chains. They call it pleasure, release, stress relief. Carl Jung would call it something else entirely: psychological suicide. And here's what nobody tells you about this prison. The more you think you're in control, the more controlled you actually are. Right now, as you're watching this, your brain is fighting a war you don't even know you're losing. There's a mechanism inside your mind that's been hijacked, rewired, reprogrammed to keep you weak, distracted, and completely neutralized. Jung spent his entire career studying the human psyche, mapping the unconscious mind, understanding what makes men powerful versus what makes them pathetic. And what he discovered about sexual addiction would terrify you if you understood the implications. This isn't about morality. This isn't about religion. This is about power, and you're giving yours away every single time you click that screen. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to reveal will destroy your comfortable excuses. Jung discovered that the unconscious mind speaks in symbols, and sexual compulsion is your psyche screaming that something fundamental is broken inside you. But instead of listening to that message, instead of doing the difficult work of integration, you're medicating the symptom and making the disease worse. The average man today consumes more sexual imagery in 1 week than his grandfather saw in his entire lifetime. And you think that's normal? You think your brain can handle that level of stimulation without consequences? Jung would tell you that you're fracturing your psyche, splitting yourself into pieces, creating what he called complexes that operate independently of your conscious will. Every time you engage in compulsive sexual behavior, you're not just wasting time or energy, you're literally programming your unconscious mind to keep you trapped in adolescent patterns that prevent you from ever becoming a complete man. And the worst part, you're defending your prison. You're telling yourself it's natural, healthy, that everyone does it. But that's exactly what a prisoner would say when he's forgotten what freedom feels like. Here's the first truth that will shatter your worldview. Sexual addiction isn't about sex at all. It's about avoiding the terrifying work of becoming who you actually are. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of integrating all the fractured parts of yourself into a coherent whole. But individuation is painful, confronting, impossible to do while you're constantly escaping into fantasy. Think about what happens when you're alone with yourself, truly alone. No distractions, no screens, no escape routes. What do you feel? For most men, the answer is uncomfortable emptiness, vague anxiety, a sense that something is missing. And instead of sitting with that feeling, instead of exploring what it's trying to tell you, you reach for the nearest dopamine hit. Sexual compulsion becomes the ultimate avoidance mechanism, a way to never face the fundamental questions that Jung considered essential for masculine development. Who am I beneath all these roles and performances? What do I actually want versus what I've been conditioned to want? What parts of myself have I rejected and projected onto others? These questions require sustained self-reflection, the kind that only happens in solitude, in boredom, in the uncomfortable space between stimulus and response. But the sexually addicted man never experiences that space. He's constantly filling it with artificial intensity, training his brain that discomfort must be immediately relieved rather than explored. Jung discovered something that modern neuroscience has confirmed. Your unconscious mind is far more powerful than your conscious willpower. You think you're choosing to engage in sexual behavior, but you're not choosing anything. Your unconscious programming is running automatically, triggered by cues you don't even notice, operating through patterns established years ago. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. Every time you act on the compulsion, you strengthen the neural pathway that makes the behavior more automatic next time. You're not just developing a habit, you're rewiring your brain's fundamental operating system. The sexually compulsive man becomes a puppet of his own unconscious patterns, convinced he's making free choices while actually operating on autopilot. Jung would say you've created an autonomous complex, a split-off part of your psyche that has its own agenda, its own energy, its own control over your behavior. And that complex doesn't care about your goals, your relationships, or your potential. It cares about one thing: feeding itself. The second devastating truth cuts even deeper. Sexual addiction destroys your capacity for genuine intimacy by teaching you that other people are objects for your gratification. Jung understood that healthy sexuality emerges from connection between two complete individuals, but sexual addiction is fundamentally solitary, narcissistic, disconnected from real human relationship. When you train your brain to associate sexual arousal with pixels on a screen, with fantasy scenarios that have nothing to do with actual human connection, you're programming yourself to be incapable of authentic intimacy. The sexually addicted man brings this programming into his real relationships, treating his partner as a prop in his private fantasy, rather than a real person with her own interior world. He's physically present but psychologically absent, going through the motions of intimacy while actually alone in his head, and she knows it. She can feel that he's not really there, that he's relating to some fantasy version of her rather than who she actually is. This creates what Jung called the erosion of the soul, a gradual disconnection from authentic feeling and genuine presence. Here's where it gets really dark. Jung discovered that what we repress in ourselves we project onto others, and then become obsessed with controlling. Sexual addiction is often rooted in the shadow, those aspects of yourself that you've rejected and refused to acknowledge. Maybe it's your need for power in a life where you feel powerless. Maybe it's your rage at feeling controlled, which you act out through sexual domination fantasies. Maybe it's your desperate need for validation that you can't get in your actual life, so you seek it through the temporary ego boost of sexual conquest or consumption. The specific content of your sexual compulsion reveals what you're avoiding in yourself, what parts of your psyche are demanding integration, but getting medicated instead. And here's the trap. The more you try to control the behavior through willpower alone, the stronger it becomes, because you're still avoiding the underlying psychological material that's driving it. The third brutal truth will make you angry, but anger means it's hitting something real. Sexual addiction is how you give away your masculine power to an industry that profits from keeping you weak. Jung understood that energy is finite, that your psychic energy, what he called libido, can flow in different directions depending on where you direct your attention. The sexually addicted man is hemorrhaging his vital energy into a bottomless pit, spending the creative force that could build businesses, create art, develop mastery, on temporary pleasure that leaves him emptier than before. Think about the math here. The average sexually compulsive man spends 1 to 3 hours per day on his addiction, sometimes more. That's 7 to 21 hours per week, 30 to 90 hours per month, 360 to over 1,000 hours per year. What could you build with 1,000 hours of focused attention? What skills could you master? What business could you create? But instead, that energy disappears into a void that gives you nothing back except the need to repeat the behavior tomorrow. Jung discovered that masculine power comes from sublimation, the process of redirecting base instincts toward higher purposes. The great creators, leaders, and visionaries throughout history weren't superhuman. They just learned to channel their sexual energy into their work, instead of dissipating it through compulsive release. This is why monks take vows of celibacy, not because sex is evil, but because they understand that sexual energy, when preserved and redirected, becomes rocket fuel for spiritual and creative development. The sexually addicted man never discovers this power because he's constantly depleting himself, living in a permanent state of post-orgasmic flatness that Jung called psychic stagnation. His ambitions feel distant and unachievable, not because he lacks talent, but because he lacks the concentrated energy necessary to pursue them. The fourth truth exposes the psychological mechanism that keeps you trapped. Sexual addiction creates a false self that prevents you from ever knowing who you really are. Jung distinguished between the persona, the mask we wear for the world, and the true self that exists beneath all performance. But the sexually addicted man develops an even deeper split between his public presentation and his private compulsion. He becomes a performer in every area of life, showing people the version of himself he wants them to see while hiding the shameful secret of his addiction. This constant performance is exhausting, and more importantly, it prevents genuine self-knowledge. How can you know yourself when you're always hiding, always managing your image, always afraid of being discovered? Jung observed that men who live this split existence eventually lose touch with their authentic desires, values, and capacities. They become hollow, going through the motions of life without genuine engagement. The fifth devastating truth reveals the spiritual dimension that Jung considered most important. Sexual addiction blocks access to what he called the numinous, those transcendent experiences that give life meaning and purpose. Jung understood that humans need connection to something greater than themselves, whether you call it God, the collective unconscious, or universal consciousness. But compulsive sexuality is inherently reductive, pulling your attention downward into base physical sensation rather than upward toward transcendent meaning. The sexually addicted man loses access to the full spectrum of human experience, becoming trapped in the lowest levels of consciousness where everything revolves around immediate gratification and tension relief. Jung observed that spiritual experiences require what he called a prepared vessel, a psyche that's developed enough to hold and integrate transcendent encounters. But the compulsive man has fractured his psyche, split his attention, depleted his vital energy to the point where he's incapable of the sustained concentration that spiritual experience requires. The sixth truth exposes something most men never realize. Sexual addiction rewires your brain's reward system so that nothing else brings satisfaction. Jung understood neuroplasticity before neuroscience had a name for it, recognizing that repeated behaviors create grooves in the psyche that become harder to escape over time. When you flood your brain with supernormal stimuli, imagery designed by professionals to be more arousing than anything you'd encounter in real life, you're training your reward system to expect unrealistic levels of stimulation. Real life, real relationships, real achievements stop registering as rewarding because they can't compete with the intensity of your addiction. The sexually compulsive man finds himself increasingly unable to enjoy normal pleasures. Food tastes bland, conversation seems boring, his work feels meaningless. Nothing satisfies because his brain has been conditioned to need extreme stimulation just to feel baseline normal. This creates what Jung called a poverty of soul, an inability to find richness in ordinary life because you've trained yourself to need constant intensity. The seventh brutal truth reveals the social dimension of your personal prison. Sexual addiction makes you manipulable, predictable, and easy to control. Jung understood that individuals who haven't integrated their shadow, who haven't faced their compulsions honestly, become susceptible to external manipulation. The sexually addicted man is living with a secret that makes him vulnerable. He can be shamed into compliance, threatened with exposure, manipulated through his need to hide his behavior. Even when nobody is actively exploiting his vulnerability, he's already compromised, making choices based on protecting his secret rather than pursuing his authentic goals. This makes him fundamentally unfree, living in a self-imposed cage where the fear of discovery determines his choices more than his authentic desires. And society, whether deliberately or accidentally, benefits from keeping men in this state. The sexually addicted man is distracted, depleted, ashamed, perfect citizen material. Here's what nobody tells you about the deeper mechanism at work. Every time you act on sexual compulsion, you're training yourself to betray your own values, to break promises to yourself, to prove that you can't be trusted with your own commitments. Jung called this the erosion of self-respect, and it's more devastating than most men realize. You tell yourself you'll stop, that this is the last time, that tomorrow you'll start fresh, and then tomorrow comes and you do it again. This pattern doesn't just create shame about the behavior itself, it creates a fundamental distrust of your own word, even to yourself. The sexually addicted man develops what Jung called a weak ego, not because he lacks intelligence or capability, but because he's proven to himself repeatedly that he cannot govern his own behavior. This weak ego affects everything. He stops setting ambitious goals because he doesn't believe he'll follow through. The eighth truth exposes the opportunity cost that Jung considered most tragic. While you're imprisoned in sexual compulsion, your real work in the world remains undone. Jung believed that every person has what he called a calling, unique work that only they can do, contributions that will remain unmade if they don't step into their potential. But the sexually addicted man never discovers his calling because he's too busy servicing his addiction. His creative energy, the force that could produce art, build businesses, solve problems, help others, gets wasted in solitary compulsion that produces nothing of value. Think about the mathematics of this tragedy. If you're spending even 1 hour per day on sexual compulsion, that's 365 hours per year, 7,300 hours over 20 years. What could you create with 7,000 hours of focused attention? The ninth and final truth is the one Jung considered most important. You cannot think your way out of sexual addiction, you must feel your way through it. Jung understood that compulsive behavior is always a defense against unbearable feeling, and the only way to break the compulsion is to develop the capacity to feel what you've been avoiding. For most sexually addicted men, beneath the compulsion is a well of pain, loneliness, inadequacy, shame, fear, rage that they've been medicating for years or decades. The addiction isn't the problem. It's the solution to a deeper problem, and you can't remove the solution until you address what it's solving. This is why willpower alone never works for overcoming addiction. You can force yourself to abstain for days or weeks, but eventually the unprocessed feelings become unbearable, and you return to the behavior that relieves them. Jung would tell you that recovery requires emotional development, building the capacity to sit with uncomfortable feelings without immediately reaching for relief. Everything you just learned changes your relationship with yourself forever, and right now, you're at a choice point that will determine the trajectory of your entire life. Write in the comments, "I choose consciousness over compulsion," because declaring this publicly activates something in your psyche that silent reading never touches. You're not just acknowledging information, you're making a commitment, joining men who refuse to waste another day imprisoned in patterns that steal their potential. Your comment becomes evidence that you're serious about this transformation, that you're done making excuses and ready to do the difficult work of becoming free. This channel exists for men committed to that journey, men who value truth over comfort, growth over pleasure, freedom over familiar chains. Subscribe because this conversation goes deeper with every video, providing the psychological tools and philosophical frameworks you need to break free from the prisons you've built. Hit that like button because it signals you're ready for content that respects your intelligence enough to tell you hard truths instead of comfortable lies. The men who engage here are warriors in the most important battle you'll ever fight, the battle for sovereignty over your own mind, energy, and life direction. But here's what you need to understand about what's coming in the next video. Everything you learned here about sexual addiction, all 9 brutal truths about the prison you've built, that's just the surface level. There's a deeper trap waiting beneath this one, another mechanism of control so subtle that most men never even realize it's operating. What I'm going to reveal next will make this conversation seem gentle by comparison, because what's coming challenges the fundamental assumption you hold about happiness, success, and what makes life worth living. The next video exposes a system of control so sophisticated that you defend it even while it's destroying you, so deeply embedded that questioning it feels like questioning reality itself. Some men will watch it and feel liberated for the first time in their lives. Others will feel angry because truth often registers as attack when you've built your identity on illusions. Either way, you'll be different after watching it. The next video is waiting for you right now, and the man who finishes it will understand himself and his world in ways that most people never achieve. That's not hype. That's what happens when you stop consuming content designed to make you comfortable and start consuming truth designed to make you free. I'll see you there, and I'll see you free.